Just a reminder that all participants on registration did agree to be recorded. And thank you all for making it tonight. We really appreciate your time. We know it's the first day of spring and people are itching to get outside and whatnot, but in Duluth, Old Man Winter is returning for a stint here, as in some of the other places around the Midwest. I want to say bonjour. My name is Marnie Keski. I'm the Cultural Preservation Specialist with the 1854 Treaty Authority. For those of you that don't know us, we're an intertribal net tree source management agency working for the Boys Fort Band, Chippewa, and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa in protecting and implementing off-reservation treaty harvest. And a term that was first thrown around as global warming climate change is essentially massive fluctuations and changes to large scale systems, such as deep ocean welling, which fuels the majority of abiotic and biological systems worldwide. And so at a local scale, we experience these changes to precipitation regimes and comprehensive temperature parameters, resulting as increased storm intensity, extended summer seasons, warmer nights, drought, things like that. From a socioeconomic perspective, undoubtedly climate change drives a wedge further separating the haves and have-nots. So at 1854, as resource managers, we work to protect and preserve treaty harvest and the wellness of the culturally significant beings on which those rights exist. I'd like you guys to consider the political agreements such as treaties that, which are really tied to the landscape and have fixed borders. These really incapacitate Native communities from maintaining obligatory relationships with the relatives on the landscape, whereas some four-leggeds and winged critters have the capacity to migrate. The rooted and finned are really disadvantaged. So this really drives our purpose at 54, to plan ahead to withstand and mitigate some extreme effects and enable our communities to be resilient once again. If you guys are like me, I really struggle with the intangibility of climate discussions. And so I'm gonna ask our team to do their best tonight to bring down their language and work to supply us with examples that we can really chew on. So here's how tonight's gonna roll. I'm gonna introduce our team. They're each gonna give short presentations. And then we're gonna open it up for Q&A. Just housekeeping reminders. Please keep your microphone muted. We have a couple co-hosts, which will do that in case we get dogs barking or babies crying or something. And if you do need to leave, we understand. It's no problem. We all know that we're a part of working lives, and a recording will be available up on 1854's YouTube channel just as fast as my little fingers can type after we close up today. So without further ado, I would like to start with introductions. I don't know which box Tyler's in there. He is. Hey, Tyler. Tyler Casper is our environmental biologist with the 1854 Treaty Authority. Steve Shire over there, hoping that he fixed his technological issues. He's the climate specialist with 1854. Hey, Steve. Then we have Heidi. What an awesome surprise. Heidi, you're an assistant professor and extension specialist with for the Climate Science, is it Institute?
Sorry, had to unmute.
Yeah, no, I'm assistant professor of climate science in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota.
Awesome.
I'm the director of the Climate Adaptation Partnership.
That's a lot of words for a title.
It's a lot of words. Basically, I study climate. That's all you really need to say.
And to your right, in your little square, you're together with Nate Meyer. Nate is the MCAP Associate Director, the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership Associate Director. Then we have Jamie Mosel, U of M Climate Resilience Extension Educator. She's a rock star. And then also Eve. Eve is a graduate research assistant with the MCAP. And I don't know, without further ado, I think I'm going to pass it over to Tyler to start. Tyler is probably the longest running person with the climate program in 1854, so he's going to give us some of the background on our project, our program.
Okay, so you're going to put the slides up?
You bet. it look okay?
Now it does. Perfect. Well, hello everyone. Glad you could make it tonight. Like Mari said, I'm Tyler Casper. I work for the 1854 Treaty Authority as an environmental biologist, and I'm going to give the first few slides of a presentation, really summarizing some of the climate adaptation planning and implementation that we've done in the 1854 ceded territory. Next slide. And Marnie, this is usually what I kind of talk about who we are, what we do, and Marnie did a great job summarizing that, so I'm not gonna go over that too much. Just this ceded territory you see here, this is where all of our work takes place. It's off reservation, working for Boys Fort and Grand Portage. You see the Fond du Lac, Band of Lakes, Pier, Chippewa in this area as well. They have also reserved treaty rights off reservation in the same ceded territory. They do manage their own off-reservation rights. We work with them on a lot of different projects, and there's a lot of good collaboration since it is the same area. Next slide. And this is a little bit more about us. This is kind of how we're organized. I'm in the resource management division. You can see some of the different programs we have here. Climate change is underlined because it's the best one. Just kidding. But that's how we're broke down. We typically have right now about 7 full-time staff in the division, and then we're hiring a few more on, some seasonal too, so might be 10 or 11 coming up here. We also have enforcement. We have Marnie's division, cultural preservation, education outreach. We also have administrative, and you can see some highlighted pictures here from some of our program work. And we're definitely privileged to be able to do this kind of work. Next slide. These are some of the changes that we understand have happened to date in the ceded territory. These are figures and data from the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessment, so GLESA, University of Michigan. And this is pretty well focused in on the ceded territory for the most part. You can see the kind of the date range in which the mostly looking at temperature and precipitation in that time frame. And things have changed in the ceded territory. Temperatures have increased. And you look at that, I think 2.6 degrees, that's not a big deal, but really it's kind of when the time of year that's happening. And it, as we've seen this year for sure, it really is a big deal. It could cause a lot of change. This winter has been probably the strangest that most people I've talked to have ever seen in the area. And it's a very truncated winter for sure. The biggest changes in this time frame, and again, this isn't even including 2024 yet, the biggest increases have occurred in winter minimum temperatures. We have definitely seen that this year, but over the long term, that is the trend. Precipitation overall has increased. It's been highly variable. But it's not so much the amount, it's the timing and intensity of the rain and when it's coming and when it's really not. We're seeing more and more over recent decades, you're seeing a massive flood event followed by drought. And so that's really what's changed the most and what is causing the most impacts and that people have seen. And again, when's it coming? Like the warming temperatures in the winter, we're seeing more rain in the winter time than we ever have also. And it's like, so you got to think of what does that mean? And that ties right in with phenology. So the timing of seasonal events, things of, well, this year in particular, lake ice cover. It was on very late this year and it's coming off very early. So overall, ice duration for this season is very short. Over the long term, it's been the trend, not only just ceded territory, but Minnesota. 3 to 5 days earlier ice off over the last, since like, say 50 years. And actually ice on dates, I just saw an article summing it up as somewhere around 9 days later than the average. So it's definitely again, less ice, freeze and frost. Again, we're having a longer frost-free season. So we're trying to think about what does that mean for things. Again, back to precipitation. Last year we had record snow, and this year we have record snow on the other end of things, like the least amount. So pretty crazy, and it's the extremes that we're seeing the most now, whether it be high or low. Next slide, please. And so again, really for us, it's trying to understand how that's going to affect the cultural beings and relatives that are most important to not only the tribes that we serve, but the tribes in the greater Great Lakes region. Because a lot of them are the same. You see a few of them highlighted here that are utilized for subsistence. They're central to culture. But everything is important, and that's something we learn more and more as we talk with tribal staff and tribal community members. There's no hierarchy or anything like that, but again, these are just to highlight some of the ones that have really come up as important and potentially impacted. Next slide, please. So in 2016, so really from 2015 to 16, we worked with the Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, and Bois Forte bands as equal partners to develop a climate adaptation plan to really try to understand how climate has changed, how it's projected to change, how vulnerable are the beings and relatives in the ceded territory to the changes, and then really try to decide what are some of the things that we could do about it. We had contractor assistance through Adaptation International, and they subcontracted GLISA to do the climate assessment. And what you see here is what came out of the vulnerability assessment. And it's basically looking at adaptive capacity, which is really the ability, best that we know, that each of these beings and relatives have to adapt to changes in climate. And the sensitivity is to, again, best of our knowledge, how vulnerable, how sensitive are they to the changes. Then we have a vulnerability ranking. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see it's green, which is low sensitivity and highly adaptable. So things are probably going to do pretty well and have been doing well. White-tailed deer, for sure, we've seen that. Black crappie, you see some other ones here in that greenish area. And then if you look to the lower right-hand corner, those are the things that have high sensitivity and not a great adaptive capacity. In other words, not very adaptable to the changes that we're seeing and that are projected. And things like moose, and that's really no surprise, I'm sure, to people, boreal wetlands, northern white cedar, and so on there. So again, this was limited to not everything. We tried to get timing and budget. We couldn't do them all, but we had at least selected a number of them that really come up a lot in conversations that are really management priorities for us. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Shire, our climate specialist, and he's going to talk about our monitoring, implementation, and also going to cover what we're doing to update the plan. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Apologize any wonkiness. I'm coming at you with my cell phone at the moment, but yeah. So as he was saying, kind of riding on the back of our climate plan, we started implementing a lot of environmental monitoring, stuff like that. One of the programs we do is monitoring lake temperature. Walleye being one of our focus species for the Treaty Authority. And just with climate change in general, fish may face increasing stress from warming waters and reduced dissolved oxygen. There are some concerns of changes occurring in timing and duration of lake stratification, which could impact aquatic species and create dead zones in water bodies. So right around 2015, we selected 20 lakes that were part of our electrofishing monitoring program, and we put long-term temp loggers in those. Next slide, please. And just we also monitor Lake Vermilion, which being one of the important inland fisheries that we have in the ceded territory. we want a more robust idea of what the changes that were occurring in the lake were. So we created a logger chain to install at this site, and basically it reads temperatures at depth intervals from the bottom to the surface. We also have dissolved oxygen monitors monitoring there. It's also useful because it can help us identify the location and formation of the thermocline, which is the depth at which the water isn't mixing. Next slide, please. So that's a lot of our summer field season, and then in the winter field season, we switch over to ice and snow monitoring. So we have 10 lakes that we check throughout the ceded territories for ice thickness, and then in partnership with those, we also have snow stations we monitor as well. In addition to that, with the partnership of our wildlife staff and other agencies, we also monitor seasonal snowpack throughout Moose Range. And as you can see in the upper right there, the moose also seem to enjoy our stations as scratching posts. Next slide, please. So beyond the direct environmental monitoring we also utilize cameras and acoustic recorders to track seasonal changes, which is also phenology. And we monitor ice in and ice out at 3 wild rice lakes that we monitor. And then we have a partnership with Laurel Wilson from Grand Portage, where we record wetland areas for the spring arrival of waterfowl and amphibians. And something of increasing interest for us at the 1854, and definitely within the band members too, we're hearing a lot within our community and interviews and stuff, is the sugar bush and the maple syrup tapping and everything like that. So we are working on getting a more robust way to monitor that more and see where the changes are occurring in that. Next slide, please. Yeah, so back to our vulnerability and assessment plan. We're currently working to update our 2016 plan with our partners and collaborators, including the bands of the Ceded Territory, MCAP, and NOAA Sea Grant. In addition, while not listed, I just wanted to mention, the great assistance that we're getting from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission and their climate team, which is led by Rob Kroll. Next slide. Yeah, so here's a kind of a rough generalization of what we're doing so far. We've completed an informal and internal evaluation of how that plan was used so far. Jamie Mosel from MCAP has drafted our updated climate projection section, and we got some great feedback from that, and we're working on getting that finished up. And then Marnie, our education and outreach coordinator, is leading our tribal community engagement interviews, which you may have heard something about. We've been going out and talking to band members and just asking them, concerns and stuff, and things related to climate change impacts that they're seeing, things that we should be aware of, just trying to get a lot more engagement with the band members themselves, and just like to help us. Looking forward, we'll be workshopping updates to our vulnerability assessments. That's coming up in April. And then after that, looking at our adaptation strategies. And then once we're done with those, we'll look at how the updated plan with all the new information and how we're going to include like the community engagement stuff and how to make a really nice plan that includes a lot of new information. Next slide, please. So here's a very rough timeline we've put together. So being in March, we're retooling our vulnerabilities. We're reassessing a lot of vulnerabilities, I guess, that we had looked at in comparison to Glifwick's plan, and realized that there was some room to engage with subject matter experts and kind of determine if we want to change our classifications of our vulnerabilities. And we're looking at getting our workshop together and kind of cleaning up a lot of those vulnerabilities and reassessing. Then after that, we're going to move into and finalize our strategies. We're going to be really talking to a lot of, experts. Like, if we're talking about strategies for forestry, we should be talking to foresters. So talking to a lot of, I have it listed as SMEs, but subject matter experts. And then finally, we're hoping to have an opportunity to present, share what we've learned from all of our community engagement and all these interviews, and present how we're going to add that. And then obviously, as timelines go, we've got some wiggle room there towards the end of the year. Next slide. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll hold questions now until the end, but we're gonna hand it over to what makes more sense, Nate or Jamie, Heidi?
How about if I just say that we, with the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, have just been really pleased to be able to partner with the 1854 Treaty Authority and really with Tyler and Steve to help support the project. So I think you're gonna hear more from Jamie and Eve, who have really been instrumental in helping with the project. But essentially, our role has been to provide a connection to Minnesota's latest generation of climate projections, so we can look a little bit better at how the climate change might be changing in the ceded territory in the future, as well as connection to other university expertise and resources to support the timeline that Steve really did a great job of articulating. So I think with that, I've sort of laid it out. We're happy to answer any questions about MCAP toward the end, but I can turn it over.
I'm gonna share my screen quick. Let's see. Okay. I'm just gonna share, Nate referred to some climate projections for looking into the future using what we're calling affectionately the Minnesota climate. And this is publicly available, but for the vulnerability assessment update that Steve mentioned, I've been working on specifically the climate change chapter, and we're using a lot of this newer climate data to inform that chapter. So just to kind of give you a little bit of overview as I show you just a few snippets of those projections, this is kind of what we're looking at when we're looking at into the future projections. So we've got kind of a lower and a higher emissions scenario. And when we use our tool, there's a little bit more explanation that goes into the specific titles for those scenarios, but this gives a good conceptual idea for the lower emission scenario in darker blue, higher emission scenario in red, and then we've got this orange kind of zigzaggy line. That's average temperature in Fahrenheit. Those are recorded data through time up until the present. But then obviously we don't have those yet for the future, but we have projections that give us an idea of where we might be headed. And sorry, behind me, the vent just turned on. So we've got some climate adaptation happening in this room. But so what I want you to really think about is that when we're looking out into about mid-century, there's a lot of overlap between the lower emissions and the higher emissions. And so that means when we're looking forward, there's some amount of warming and some amount of climate change that's really built in. What's really critical to realize is that as we look further down the line, later in time, so those future generations that we're thinking about, we want to really make sure we're keeping things as towards the lower end as much as possible. That's where things start to diverge, and those higher emission scenarios have a lot more severe potential impacts on the planet and ecosystems and ways of life. So I just want to kind of get you guys oriented to what we're thinking about with observed changes. So Tyler talked about some observed changes we've seen in the 1854 ceded territory, and then I'm going to show some looking into the future, what we might see depending on kind of how society responds to the call to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So these are examples of kind of what you can pull from this tool, and I'll share the tool at the end. It's probably kind of like overwhelming to see on the screen right here, but these are showing two different climate change scenarios. So on the left-hand side, that's a shared socioeconomic pathway 2, 4, 5. And so when you go into the tool, that's corresponding to more of a lower or moderate emissions scenario. When we look on the right-hand side of the screen, that's the shared socioeconomic pathway, or SSP 585, and that's a higher emission scenario. So we can really compare here moderate and high emissions right next to each other. What these figures are showing in particular is the change in average annual temperature. So that's the temperature for the entire year, including winter and the summer. And then in the highlighted black area, that's 1854 ceded territory. And we can see that the light colors of orange, that's showing how much, what that daily average temperature is projected to be in mid-century, so 2040 to 2059. And we can look at this for other variables when we're thinking about heat, because we don't always know the average annual temperature. What does that feel like? I don't know. In Minnesota, it's kind of cold, actually. But this is looking at when we're thinking about really extreme temperatures. So the North Shore, for example, doesn't have a lot of 90-degree days in general. That's pretty hot for that area. With this data, we can project into the future for that moderate emission scenario and a high emission scenario, the average number of days that will be above 90 degrees. And so we can see that maybe we'll gain 3 to 9 more days of above 90-degree temperatures, which has a lot of impacts on things like public health, has a lot of impacts on water, like Steve mentioned, has a lot of impacts on plants in general. So then we can also look at, this is on the other end of the spectrum, are really cold temperatures, which are also super important for controlling things like bugs and diseases that affect trees, a whole host of things, supporting healthy moose like the cooler temperatures too. So again, we've got on the left-hand side that moderate emission scenario. And again, this is mid-century. And we're looking at average number of days below 32. And that's projected to go down. So you can see that these numbers are actually negative scale. So potentially a loss of maybe 21 to 15 days of temperatures below 32 degrees. And when we're coming out of a year like that, that's really startling to think about. So yeah. Then we can also look at other variables like precipitation. So again, this is moderate and high emission scenarios. And in this case, you can actually see some variation. The temperatures that I've showed for the previous figures have been pretty consistent across the two emission scenarios, but you can see here now we've got a lot more regional and topographic variation. So on the left is that moderate emissions mid-century average annual precipitation, and we see a lot of dark blue and purple, so potential increases in precipitation or rainfall. Then when we're looking in that same variable for a higher emission scenario, it's a bit more variable. We've got some red, we can really see kind of that higher resolution of how those changes might play out on the landscape. And then this is, I think, the last slide from here, and then I'll just open up the tool so you can, I'll pop it in the chat too, so people can explore it themselves where you're sitting right now. But this is looking at average snow cover depth, again, for moderate emissions and higher emissions. And that's, again, the scale is negative. So it's looking like a loss, a difference from historical snow cover depth, of a loss of maybe 1 inch, maybe 1.4 inches, reduction in the average snow cover depth compared to what we're really used to. And so then I was just going to show you, you can check these out here in the tool itself. Can you guys see my screen still? Good. Okay. So if you just go to app.climate.umn.edu, you can check it out. And what's really cool is, so we can zoom in. Let's say we want to zoom in 1854 ceded territory. We can create a map. So draw from here, we can select all sorts of different categories. So ceded territory boundaries, there we go. We can select 1854 ceded territory. So this is how I've created these maps, and that they are at a resolution of about 2.6 by 2.6 miles. So that's pretty cool. That's like the state fairgrounds. And then, yeah, we can choose if we want modeled values or the difference between the past and the future projections. And then we can choose, like I said, these different emission scenarios. So those are looking at, the decisions that society makes, whether we're going to try and curb those emissions, whether they're going to increase, that sort of thing. We can choose one. And we can choose the variable. So this is daily maximum temperature. And we can choose the time frame. So do we want the year? Do we want a specific season? And yeah, you can zoom in pretty far for a lot of these. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then looks like, oh yeah, reach the tools. Oh yeah, some comments in there. So we can talk about those in a bit. But yeah, I'll stop sharing. And yeah, Marnie, I think that's all I had for that. But I encourage folks to go take a look at that tool. And just explore it. We're going to have increasingly more information about that area. And then when the vulnerability assessment comes out, there's going to be updates from that tool as well.
That was awesome, Jamie. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Miigwech.
We're gonna throw it over to Eve now. Eve, what you've put together for our project is really essential. It's like the backbone of the work as we head into the workshop and updating the plan. So take it away.
Alrighty, so yeah, I'm gonna pull it back a little bit all the way to what Steve was talking about with the 2016 climate plan first. So yeah, back in 2016, the 1854 Treaty Authority, Boys Ford, Fond du Lac, and Grand Portage kind of came together and created a climate plan that had like 538 strategies of, like how to tackle climate. It was all the species you can think of. It was like plants and animals and like air quality. And they kind of like created this plan, set out into the world, and was like, okay, let's see what happens. So in the early 2023, kind of we all came together and thought, okay, it's about time we kind of look at the plan. How was it utilized? What updates can be made to, just make it more effective, more just like usable? And also, are there species we're missing? Are there strategies we're missing? Are there ones that were not useful at all? So in early 2023, with that understanding of that we needed an update, the MCAP and the 1854 Treaty Authority kind of went out to all the tribal partners and asked them to report on their projects, and since 2016, what climate related projects have you done? And what species were you looking at? What strategies from the plan did you use? And after kind of compiling this list, in about the summer of 2023, we sat down and then started just looking, okay, which who used which strategies, who used which species, which species were not touched at all, to just trying to understand which strategies were used, how were they used. Kind of we're going back and forth between with some tribe partners, having some interviews, asking, are we correct? Are we missing any information from you guys? And ultimately, we kind of developed a working draft report that summarized which of the strategies were used. And we were also looking for just trends in areas that we found that were working really well and were not working really well. And so then after we kind of understood which strategies and species we're focused on, we went back to a few trial partners and did another couple series of interviews trying to understand, oh, well, you're working a lot on forestry projects. Was that because, was there something that happened in the past few years that made you want to work on that? And like, we also understood that some different people had different capacities for reporting projects. And we realized, oh, maybe having the spreadsheet of, people reporting their projects wasn't the most effective way in getting results because everybody's busy. Not everyone has time to, type in years worth of projects into a spreadsheet to report upon. So from that, we also understood that we really need to ground any of the updates we were doing in the future in interviews and just sitting down and talking to everybody and understanding what worked and what didn't work with the plan, just because, again, kind of trying to format into a spreadsheet isn't always the most effective. So with that understanding, we kind of took that to mind, and that's kind of also informs the work that Marnie and Jamie have been doing more recently with just like talking to a bunch of people from all the different tribes and asking them, what species have you been looking at? What changes in the climate have you been seeing? And so we've been using that information to kind of create a list and a series of questions that we were going to be working on, incorporating into the updated plan. Additionally, the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission produced a species vulnerability assessment this past year, which, has a lot of the same species that are in the 1854 ceded territory. And we realized, they were marking some species as being maybe a little bit more vulnerable or having a little less vulnerability than we had in 2016. So with that in mind, we've created kind of like a comparison between 2016 plant species vulnerability and the Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission species vulnerability. And in that workshop that I think Steve or Tyler had mentioned in a month from now, we will be kind of just like really digging down and saying, okay, are there changes that we want to be reflected in our plan update going forth? So yeah, I think that at this point, we're kind of just working towards taking that analysis that we did of the strategies and species that were used in the 2016 plan, and we're just using a bunch of interviews and trying to root any updates and changes we make to the strategies and species we include in the lived experiences of people living in the 1854 ceded territory. And then additionally, we're having a workshop to kind of parse out some of the more technical details of, should Manuman be it was at high vulnerability, should we make it extremely vulnerable? Or, for let's say berries, maybe it was like medium vulnerability, but maybe it's a little bit lower vulnerability now because of certain changes to the climate. So that's all information we're working on trying to pull together for the updated plan, hopefully to make it more effective, usable, easy to approach, and just make sure that if there were any gaps in information that we left out in 2016, they are filled with the updated version.
That was awesome, Eve. Thank you. I do want to give Joseph some attention. Joseph Bauer-Kemper is also kind of on our climate team here, or one of our main players. And he's the associate professor of American Indian Studies with UMD. I don't think I introduced him at the beginning, but he is here and listening tonight. And I just need to say thank you, Joseph, for all the support you provide me as one of your M-Trees students. I couldn't do it without you.
Yeah, thanks, Marnie. Appreciate all the work y'all are doing. This is great.
I don't know, does anybody else on our team want to describe a couple of things, maybe things that they think are important for, to be transparent to our constituency and our partners? Or should we kick it off to Q&A? Oh, I do have something to say. We have a really mixed audience tonight, and for those that live and work in Indian country, us as resource managers, we wear a lot of different hats on the daily. And just as you saw in Tyler's slides, all of those pictures were from a week of experience in the field. You know, most people, if you're working for a state or federal agency, you're focused on one project. And whereas we're tied, we're spread pretty thin, right? It's exciting and sometimes stressful, but that's where partnerships really strengthen how much and leads to giving us more capacity in what we can do. And so, in partnership with MCAP, with the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, they're really enabling us to do a better job and connecting us with more resources as they support us through this project update. And I have to say that they have done an incredible job. We know that the University of Minnesota doesn't have the best history, doesn't have the best past in working with tribal nations, but the folks at MCAP have done a fabulous job with really respecting the sovereignty of the tribes and helping where they have the resources to do so, and asking and stepping back when they know that you know, it's the ball is not in their court. And so they're very sensitive to those issues, and it makes me have great hope for the future. So thank you to the MCAP folks. Questions?
Yeah, Marnie, I got a question. I think it was one of the Steve, maybe it was Steve, I don't see him on here, but he was talking about well, maybe talking to forestry department, tribal forestry departments, when you talk about tree species and stuff like that. Um, so I guess one of the questions I had was not only talking to tribal partners that you guys are working with, as far as like knowledge holders, and compiling that data not only from them but also from like tribal forestry departments, um, and see if there's some similarities there, or they're kind of talking about the same things as far as like different tree species that maybe have a higher or vulnerability to changes. And then the other question I had was, um, looking at climate change and forestry and logging practices, and what kind of effect that may have on wild rice waters. You know, is those types of things. That's been kind of one of my things. You know, just from being a harvester and I've seen a lot of um, I guess logging stuff going on over in our neck of the woods, um, kind of having an impact not only on hydrological levels, but um, what do they say, buffer zones, I guess, those types of things. Um, and I think I got one of our partners from the university, one of the students here from Minnesota, there is kind of putting a model together for us, and it's kind of showing some interesting things. So I was just kind of wondering, if that's something that 54 Treaty has been looking at, or those types of things.
Joe, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, I'm Joe Gravine. I'm the from Lac du Flambeau. I'm the wild rice program manager for the tribe here. And I've worked with a few of you in collaboration with University of Minnesota project over there, and we have a partnership with them. It's probably going on. I think we're going on 6 years. It's like longer than that, but yeah, it's just I'm not too much into this whole climate. Haven't been too involved, but wild rice is, it's really tied to the climate, and some of the things that I've noticed, as being a harvester, pretty much all my life, and seeing those changes and observation type stuff, and don't have all this technical, I guess, when it comes to building our program, we're using more scientific data, the equipment and collecting, starting to collect this data probably in the last 4 or 5 years. So
That's a loaded question, Joe. So Steve, do you want to field that one to start?
Yeah, I can take a initial crack at it. Tyler might have more to say. Joe, nice to meet you. Thank you for your comment. Kind of, I guess, just to back up first off, like, we want to talk to everybody that has experience, whether you're a forester or an elder or anything. I like when I was in the Army, we called them subject matter experts, people that knew what they were talking about. They knew their crap. So that's, for me, that's kind of just an umbrella term. And that's also something, honestly, that we've talked about and struggled with, is kind of where we envision the plan going and how we're gonna encompass everything. Right now we have it set up, species basis, so all our strategies and everything and adaptations is at the species level. But we have had conversations about doing like a multifaceted approach, like an umbrella approach, where we have a wetland management strategy, and those strategies trickle down into rice, they trickle down into fish, they trickle down into fur bearers and stuff like that. But yeah, we kind of we haven't landed anywhere specific yet, and that's kind of an ongoing discussion. But if you've got some ideas, I'd love to hear them. And yeah, I think, unless if Tyler has anything else to say, feel free to jump in.
No, and again, thank you, Joel. Steve, yeah, great job summing up kind of where we've been at so far with the planning. Regarding the hydrology piece, one thing that has come up in conversations, at least because I haven't been involved with community engagement, but at least with tribal staff and foresters, hydrology and wild rice has come up. Specifically, what's been talked about is what's going to happen with black ash once they're, with emerald ash borer, especially right now, they're already at Fond du Lac. Once the black ash is wiped out, what's going to happen to that hydrology and how's that going to affect the wild rice lakes? And they've done some work already to look at kind of like underplanting different species. There's been some agencies that have looked at that as well. Maybe like what might take the place of black ash if and when that happens. And it's with hydrology, I'm not sure exactly how much work has gone into looking at the different effects of hydrology when black ash is removed. But I know it's at least on the radar, and I think with some more conversations with the foresters, we should learn a little bit more about where that is at and maybe what needs to be done to have a better understanding of that. So again, no, really appreciate your comments here, Joe, and questions.
yeah, I mean, definitely. Yeah, one of the things I talked with our forestry person over here, and so they're kind of like, so like your tribal forestry, a lot of their funding comes through the Bureau, right? And it's so the Bureau, when we have those discussions with the Bureau people through forestry, it's like, well, they're saying, well, there's a certain percentage that we need to cut, and a lot of times that don't line up with our management practices, and so we kind of fight back and forth a little bit. I don't want to say fight, but we have those type of conversations that it's just we're saying, hey, instead of going 100 feet, let's go 300, for a buffer zone, or hey, don't be cutting all the tamarack or the black ash or the balsam, which is kind of, in our area, you got like 24,000 acres of wetland. So they're kind of going in and wiping out, our balsam and stuff like that. And it's just like, hey, there's some long-term effects, that when you do that, because like in our neck of wood, balsam, we've noticed, you know, it kind of has those same, it does the same job as, you know, tamarack and black ash, you know, and it kind of absorbs that acidic stuff, you know, and that when we remove those, where does it go? And then so then you're kind of looking at, you know, like the whole management type thing. So when you're cutting around wetland areas and your buffer zone's only 75 to 100 feet, you know, what is happening? And what about our deer populations? Those are kind of like, you got to have those deer, you know, to go in for someplace to go during you know, deep snow and cold winter months. But you know, they didn't have to worry too much this winter. But you know, those are the types of things that we're talking about over here when we talk about um you know, vulnerable species and plants and you know, climate and you know, how do we adapt? You know, and that's, I think that's kind of one of those things. It's, we could be doing everything that we can to I guess try to influence things, kind of, you know, to adapt to management strategies, but a lot of times I think it's those funding sources and those policies that they have don't line up with what we're doing. But yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate this. Been, you guys did a really good job on this.
Awesome.
I
Nate, go ahead.
appreciate that. I was gonna say just one more thing, you know, and again, thanks again, Joe, and for sharing the concerns that you have in your area. And there's a lot of overlap with what we're talking about in, you know, the 1854 Ceded territory. It's interesting because, like Steve mentioned, it's like, look at these strategies, and like you mentioned, Joe, it's like you gotta keep in mind and how things are interconnected. And so it's like, thinking about forestry, you're not just thinking about, it's like the wetlands hydrology, you also think about the wildlife. Um, at least like on reservation, there's gonna be some different, and there already is some different actions that are occurring on each respective reservation of each of the bands. Like, you know, Bois Forte, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac. And there's different ways they can implement things, but what's interesting, and it's good to point out too, and it's in the plan too. It's going to be different how we are able to implement strategies and what we can actually implement, because as an intertribal, we're not a land owner or manager in the ceded territory. So it's more be us understanding like how things are going to be affected, what different management can do. Is it, you know, what's good or bad as far as, like you mentioned, buffers. And on our end, that's more us talking to the land managers and promoting, like maybe it's a bigger buffer that we're pushing for, with different, you know, different actions that are proposed. So it's just like kind of like a different spot that we're in, where we're, again, we do have good working relationships with the land managers, a lot of them, which is great. But it's just like, that's just from our point of view, that's what it's gonna be, is working with them to talk about like what you mentioned, saying, hey, it's like, yeah, you guys are making the ultimate call here, but you got to keep this in mind, and maybe a larger buffer, like you mentioned, is what's needed. So that's how it's laid out in the plan. It's not really laid out that way. It's like there's these set of strategies. And then when the plan was completed in 2016, we all walked away with that same plan. But we actually sat down and it was probably a week or two, comb through them and say, okay, how are we going to implement these? And which ones actually can we implement? Because we're not being on reservation, or some that's like, well, we just can't do some of this. It's more working with partners to get this implemented into other management plans.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, I think, you know, I know I was probably kind of talking about, you know, our reservation, but I was kind of, I probably should have clarified that, because too, we also we've also had these discussions like with U.S. Forest Service, Wisconsin DNR, And I'll give you a good example, like with the U.S. Forest Service. So we border right up to the Chequamegon National Forest, and on the west side, and they had a big timber sale, right? And so they were going to go in and cut an area where historically tribal members from Flambeau have gone and picked wild leeks, and so so right away we requested that we have some consultation with this. We did some site visits and stuff with them, and they so like wild ginger, there's there's some in that area too. So it's kind of like so we were able to kind of have those type of discussions, and kind of one of those things that that working with not only on reservation but within the ceded territories too. So it's so those partnerships, and so like those what the leaks, so those are kind of on our vulnerability, our climate adaptation stuff down here in Flambeau, that I know that's on there. So it's kind of so those type we have those types of agreements, I know we have an MOU, I think with Gliffwick, and you know with the U.S. Forest Service, and they've been real receptive, and so I don't know if kind of like the 1854 treaty authority has those types of conversations, like if there's a timber sale or mining for that matter, that hey, hey, we know that this area here has wild ginger in it, you guys reach out to them, and kind of I guess with your partner tribes there, and say, hey, we'd like to discuss this some more, or whatever.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Joe, because um, I know that's fantastic. And that MOU, I mean, that's a huge step, and that's some
Tyler, you muted yourself.
man, that mute button gets me every time. But I was I was thanking you, Joe, and again appreciate it was that was a huge success, I think, with Gliffwick and that MOU with the Forest Service. And that's something that just happened with us actually in the Superior National Forest of Boys Fort, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac bands signed an MOU, and that's so new now. It's actually and Marnie was involved with this. I was not, but there's been already some workshops, and I know Joseph was there, Bauer Kemper, and it's really trying to figure out, okay, now we have this MOU. How's this gonna work? How's it gonna be implemented? And how do we get to that point where, like you're saying, there's really that co-management and early in the process when it comes to considering any of these types of projects. So we're excited to see how that goes.
Yeah, that so that's like so it's kind of neat, because like we have white reps, that go through a white task force, and that has to deal with our treaty rates over here. But one of the things that has happened over time, and that's just like, so a lot of times, like not so much the Forest Service anymore, but I know like sometimes in the past, like the Wisconsin DNR, different organizations of the state here, they would actually send a letter to Gliffwick, and so they were kind of like they thought they were what I was thinking is what we were thinking is that, hey, Gliffwick, is going to speak for all the tribes when you comment on something, so it's like we're saying, hey, no, you guys should not only be sending a letter to Gliffwick, but you should be sending those notices, or those requests to comment for permitting and everything to the tribes. Like let's say Big Trout Lake, we're right next to Big Trout Lake here, and it's like, all right, there's Flambeau, so maybe we had to send a letter to Dr. Flambeau, and see if they want consultation or whatever. So once they send those letters, they're 99.9% of the time we always ask for consultation. So that's just something to kind of be aware of, going forward with, with the Forest Service. I'm sure you guys probably already know that, but that's just our experience over here.
we're really lucky here with the Superior National Forest where they hired a full-time tribal liaison, which was usually a split time position prior to 3 or 4 years ago. Juan Martinez, he's awesome at what he does, and he's really done a great job of how he puts it. What I really like is he describes as we move towards co-management with the forest as changing federal policy isn't like rerouting a ship in the night, to another form of working together. It's a train in which you need to relay the tracks before you take off. So it's a heavy lift, but I love working with Juan, and even when I need help taking kids ice fishing, I need somebody on the spot. I text him for help, and he's able to find people doing timber cruising where they can come in and help me pull my sleds into a lake to get kids out. So yeah, I appreciate that. I was trying to track this. Lois, did you have a question early on? No? Okay. We did have a question from Ileana. She works in the PIO office, Public Information Office at Glyphwick.
Oh, I'm actually on the climate team.
Oh, really? Right, my bad.
Yeah.
My bad. Do you want to ask this question?
Oh, yeah. This was just something that over at Glyphwick, we're also working on our adaptation planning, and we've started listening sessions. And we don't really have a format for what our final product will be yet. We've been kind of waffling between, will this plan be like a menu that is a little more vague, that just has options and types of actions to pursue that the end user can think about? Or will it be sort of prescriptive of, if you have this species and you want to keep it on the landscape, you can do A, B, or C? I was just wondering if you had thought of that for your adaptation plan.
It's a good question. Which means I don't have a good answer. But because it's something, it has been mentioned, and still, and kind of like Steve showing that timeline when we're gonna get to looking at the strategies and how things should be structured. I think that's on the table to discuss for sure. It might be a blend. It might be, it's, I guess, kind of how it has been. It's been kind of a mix of some really detailed and actionable strategies, and there's some other ones that are more vague, that aren't really fleshed out. It's hard to be really prescriptive because it's going to be different for each reservation, how they're going to implement things. It's going to be different how we implement things off reservation. So the way ours are kind of already laid out, again, some are pretty detailed, but no matter how they appear in the plan, there's going to be some modifications to fit a particular situation. So maybe that's something we can consider, like the tribal adaptation menu is having at least some of them be at more of that vague level, just acknowledging that, yeah, it can be very different, but here are some broader ways of thinking of things and how you might be able to approach it.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot. I know with big projects like these, it's hard to know what the end product will look like until you actually get there.
No, it was a great question. I appreciate you bringing that up. And some of the other points you brought up in the chat are awesome. So thank you.
So, yeah, we're in real similar work right now. So always feel free to reach out and email me. We just did a trial run of our climate adaptation listening sessions, both with Glyphwick staff and with our elders group. So we're like just rolling into that and really getting those big questions of like, well, what will the end product be? And why are you asking me these questions? And like, what kind of feedback do you actually want from community members?
Well, that's perfect, because once we get down to that point, it's going to be really great to have some conversations with you to hear how this goes and what your experience is.
yeah, and this is my full-time job now, so always available if you want to check in and bounce ideas.
No, will do.
Anybody else have any questions? Nate and Heidi, do you want to bring something up? You want to chat?
No, I appreciate everybody's point of views. Liana, it was great to meet you, and we look forward to more connections in the future. And I don't know, Marnie, if you want to, I guess we have another workshop coming up, so we'll have more updates to share and more plans in the future.
I also want to give a shout out to Brett. Is that Brett Skog? It was one of the first interviews that we facilitated for this climate change adaptation update, and he's listening in tonight. I think that's him. I saw him register. I only see his first name though. I know we only planned for about an hour to talk, but you know, I'm gonna make myself available if anybody wants to continue asking questions or discuss, share stories or whatever. That's what we're here for. But also wanted to invite you guys, if there's no other discussion, feel free to check out. And again, thank you all for your time.